Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon, or good evening, or maybe even good morning for some of you. We're thrilled to have you join us today. I'm thrilled and honored to be a part of this incredible programming. My name is Jay Goldmans, and I'm a faculty member at Mayanot Yeshiva High School in Teaneck, New Jersey. And together with my partner today, Rachel Weinstein, we hope to explore together with you a couple of the issues surrounding one of the most challenging mitzvot, Tefilah, one that both inspires and vexes many an individual, as well as parents and educators. Rachel will begin talking a little bit about women's obligation in Tefilah, and then talk about an issue that is seldom explored, at least in my experience and in terms of the literature, namely the challenges of Tefilah and having kavanah in Tefilah as a mother, and for anyone whose time is not always their own. For my part, I want to explore a little bit about seeing Tefilah within the context of human development in children and adolescents, and then provide some practical advice about what parents can do, especially in light of the fact that parents are really the most important influence in the religious development of a child. We'll each speak for about 25 minutes or so, and then leave room for questions, which you can place in the chat. So let's begin by introducing my colleague. Rachel Weinstein lives in the Yeshuv of Tkoa and teaches at MMY Seminary in Yerushalayim. She's a Yoetzet Halacha and a graduate of Hilchata, the Advanced Institute for Halachic Studies at Matan. And she didn't tell me to tell you this, but she is also the author of a book called Itzumo Shel Yom, which is about women and Yom Kippur. So without further ado, b'kavod, Rachel.
Hi, I'm honored to be here with you, Rabbi Goldman. So I'm so excited and welcome everybody. And as Rabbi Goldman said, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Okay, so I want to start with a brief story of my life. And everyone knows that when you tell the story of your life, you can kind of come from different angles. So I'm going to give an angle of my Tefilah story. How, you could say where I've lived, what schools I went to. So I'm going to say, this is how I related to Tefilah in different points of my life. Okay, so I'm going to start with the part I remember, because I'm sure my parents davened with me when I was little, but I don't have so much memory of that. Like I have vague memories, but I feel like I really started davening and understanding what davening was in about the 8th grade. And you know how like in Yom Kippur, you're like counting pages to the end. So that's my memory of davening in 8th grade. And I feel like only in 9th grade did I stop counting pages, because it's not a good idea, because it doesn't look good. But in my mind, I was still counting pages. Like I didn't actually count pages, because, the guy next to you sees you're counting pages and you're already in 9th grade, and that's like not okay. And I went through high school, progressing from this place of waiting for davening to be over to slowly realizing that davening is actually a really cool thing, and that it's something I wanted to put an effort into. So as time progressed, I kind of got into that a little more. And then I got married at the age of 21, and I didn't have children right away. My first daughter was born at the age of 23. And what I had suddenly discovered as this huge treasure was very quickly kind of taken away from me in a very blunt way. Now I have 8 children, and I'm very happy that I have 8 children, and I have no complaints. They're lovely and they're a blessing. However, davening is not always so easy with 8 children. Now, obviously, they're not all 4 years old and jumping on top of me, but at any point in time, one of them is between 3 and 5 and jumping on top of me. And I feel like through the years, this was an issue for me. The question of davening, and how davening was something that became important to me, and I had such a short time to enjoy. And it's interesting how in the beginning, I would come to shul with my kids, and at some point it just didn't feel worthwhile, because I would come and I'd be outside the whole time. And then at some point I stopped coming. I would say this is about like 10, 12 years ago. I kind of stopped coming. And then I didn't stop davening, but I stopped coming to shul. And then I realized that my kids weren't going to shul either. So I made a comeback, and I started coming back to shul again, I think around 8 years ago, because I realized that if I don't go, why would they go, right? They don't see me going. And again, I davened shacharit and mincha. I would like to say every day. I try every day. But davening in a minyan was a really big challenge. Now, in my history of my relationship with davening, there are a couple of points that I want to mention where the discussion came up. So when I studied in Migdal Oz, at some point there was discussion about whether to have Yom Kippur in the midrasha. And one side said, yes, obviously, we're here for the whole year, and we have such an amazing experience. And Yom Kippur is really a very, it's a high point in our relationship with Hashem. How could we not have Yom Kippur? And the other side of the conversation said, but women who come to davening on Yom Kippur in Migdal Oz and will never have that experience again will have such a big rift between, what they imagine as the ideal and what they could do today. We can't do it. Now, the end of the story is that there is davening in Migdal Oz on Yom Kippur, and many women come with their children and their husbands, and it's something very special. But that conversation really goes with me. And funny enough, this year I had a similar conversation in MMY. So this year in MMY, there was a school trip, and it wasn't clear when the girls were supposed to daven because they were leaving. At the time they left, it was too early to daven. And by the time they got there, it would be too late, but not ideal to daven. So the suggestion was that they would daven. There was like a break in the trip. It was an Eilat trip, I think. There was a break in the trip. They were supposed to daven at the break. And the break was about 20 minutes long. And some of the girls said, it's not enough for me. Amazing, right? 20 minutes sounds like a lot to me right now. But anyway, it's not enough because they say the whole thing. Soon I'll talk about what I say. Anyway, so they said it's not enough for me. And one of the rabbis suggested that they start davening on the bus and then continue during the break. And the girls asked, where do we stop? Great question, right? What do we say on the bus? It's not very helpful to just say Modeh Ani on the bus because still 20 minutes isn't going to be enough for the rest of that. And there was a whole discussion about whether or not they can stop between Psukei de Zimra and Birkot Kirat Shema. And a whole halachic discussion went on there, and I'm not going to go into the sources, and you're welcome to ask me later or look them up. But after the discussion, I went up to one of the rabbis and I said, listen, this discussion is a really, really, really important one for women because many women are in situations where they have to stop. It's somewhere, and the question is going to be where they can stop. And it's important to discuss whether it's really usher to stop or whether it's just not preferable to stop. And the rabbi looked at me, I won't say his name, and he said, what do you mean? I mean, you start, you finish, you daven. And I said, a woman, and I mean, it's not just a woman. Later, I had a conversation with another rabbi who was saying, yes, many, many people who, again, their time is not in their hands. Many, many people who live a life that's not a life in a yeshiva or in a school, and they have to really work hard to find time to daven. It's not so simple. And I think these discussions are very, very important. Okay, so before I go on, I want to just open up my source sheet just very briefly. We're not going to go through all the sources, but I want to quickly give a little bit of a halachic background to our discussion because I teach halacha, so that's just what I have to do. So I just want to quickly go through some of the very basic sources. And I grew up knowing that women must daven. Why must women daven? So here's the basic source, that women are chayav b'tefillah, they're obligated to daven. So the Gemara in Masechet Brachot first brings the Mishnah, the Mishnah in Masechet Brachot. נשים ועבדים הקטנים פטורים מקריאת שמע ומן התפילין וחייבים בתפילה ובמזוזה ובברכת המזון. So women and slaves and children are exempt from Kirat Shema, but they're not exempt from this other list, Tefilah, meaning 18, when Chazal say Tefilah, they mean 18, mezuzah v'birkat hamazon. The Gemara goes on and says, Kirat Shema pshita. Kirat Shema, obviously, they're exempt. Why? Mitzvah taseh shazman garmahu. It's a mitzvah that's time-bound, and women are exempt from mitzvot that are time-bound. We're not going to go into a deep discussion about that. We're just going to leave it at that for now, but some of you may know that that's not so simple. But in general, we say that women are exempt from time-bound mitzvot. And the Gemara goes on to say, "B'chol mitzvot taseh shazman garma, nashim p'turot." Women are exempt from mitzvot taseh shazman garma. Ma'u the tema meaning, wait a minute, why did it even have to say that? If it's so simple, So we might have thought that because the Shema is reinstating the fact that Hashem is our God, Malchut Shamayim, then we would have thought that they do have to say it, Kamash Malan Shelo. They don't have to. Okay, we're going to skip Tefilah and Mezuzah, but I want to read the piece that just mentions Tefilah. V'chayavin b'Tefilah. So I'm going to write here the line before last in the source. V'chayavin b'Tefilah, derach meninhu. So the reason women are obligated to daven is because what is davening? Davening is asking Hashem for mercy or compassion or maybe love. But there is something about davening that we cannot give up. Okay, and this source really goes with me. And in a minute, I'll go back to it. The reason women are not exempt from tefillah, derach meninu. Now we'll see there's another explanation for why women are not exempt from tefillah, but the Gemara says we cannot let women leave this beautiful treasure behind because this is our connection with Hashem. Okay, so we can discuss whether it is a mitzvah or not, but how can we suggest that women have no relationship to davening? Because davening is such a big piece of rachmei, of our connection to Hashem. And I'm going to right now assume for the moment that rachmei is love, because in Aramaic rachmei is love. I'm sure it also means compassion, and rachamim is right. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch paskins that women are obligated to daven, and I'm not going to read it inside with you, but I am going to say that the Shulchan Aruch has a different explanation. He says that davening is not a mitzvah t'seh man grama, and you're welcome to read it in the sources. I'm just going to say it outside the source that we have an idea in the Rambam that even though tefillah is deoraita, is a Torah level obligation, the Torah level obligation does not include the times and the framework of the 3 times a day and the times. So even though it seems like tefillah is mitzvah t'seh man grama, it seems like a time bound mitzvah, there's an idea that it's not. And this appears in the Magen Avraham, which again, I'm not going to read to you because time is pressing, but you're welcome to read later. The reason I brought this Magen Avraham, though, is because the Magen Avraham says, wait a minute, women don't daven. Why don't they daven? He has to explain that they don't daven because of this, but I think this is a very important piece. The Magen Avraham looks around and he says, my mother doesn't daven, my grandmother doesn't daven, my wife doesn't daven. I'm just making it up, but the women he sees around him don't daven. And this already brings up, I think, either an assumption that women just didn't daven or the difficulty of davening. Now, I've been talking about the women's difficulty of davening, but I brought a Yerushalmi here that shows that even the Amoraim had a really hard time davening. And I'm not going to read all the examples to you of what they did when they were davening, but I do want to read the last few. So Shmuel Amar, Ana manita v'chaya. He says, when I'm davening, I'm actually counting chicks out there. We should say counting sheep, right? He's actually focused on something else. And he's saying, I wish I were davening, but I'm really focused on so many other things. I don't know what that is. He's counting something else. And this last one, I just feel we identify with so much. Amar Rabbi Matanya, Ana mechazek tivu leroshi dekad havamat emodim ukara migarmei. So he says, I'm so thankful to my body and my head that when I get to Modim, I bow. Because I don't know I'm there, but my body knows I'm there. And how many of us feel that feeling that like, oh my goodness, I'm at Modim already? How did that happen, right? Or I'm going, right? And so often we're in that situation that we're davening, but we're lost in davening, okay? Now, I want to mention the tool, and as you see, I've read all the sources that I'm not actually going to read with you, but I mentioned the tool who actually brings a lot of laws of cases in which one would not daven because he's distracted. And at the end of the day, he says, the Maharam paskins that we don't do that anymore. So he brings a whole list of people that were traveling and they don't daven for a whole 3 days, or they're in a place with a bad smell, or all these different people who wouldn't daven. And the Maharam says today, we've lost the essence of kavanah. I'll just read the last sentence with you. וכתב ההר"ם, מרוטנבורג, that's the Maharam, אין אנו נזהרים עתה בכל זה, שאין אנו מכוונים כל כך בתפילה. And the Maharam, on the one hand, is a blessing, and on the other hand, is such a tragedy. The Maharam says, daven anyways. It's a big blessing. He says, even if we can't focus enough, just do it, right? On the other hand, he says, kavanah is over. We're just not there anymore. And I really feel like this sentence is such an important sentence. And with this sentence, I want to read one more source with you, and then I'll go back to my narrative. So this source is Rav Henkin, and I typed it myself, so if there are any typos, it's totally my fault. And he's relating to the tool that I just mentioned, and he says, none of this was codified in the Shulchan Aruch. These ideas that I said that people wouldn't daven for the whole 3 days after a trip and whatever, because, as the Tur himself wrote, at least since the time of Rabbi Meir of Rothenberg, the Maharam in the 13th century, the custom became established for men to pray even when not concentrating fully, lest they never pray at all, like we said. This custom, however, was adopted by men, but not by women. Okay, so this is a chiddush that Rav Henkin says that I haven't found another source for, but I think it's fascinating. He says this idea that even though kavanah is not relevant, we still daven. This idea was adopted by men and not by women. This is his chiddush, and he says who maintained in the Talmudic exclusions. So he says the women still don't have to daven when they're distracted. The daily pressures, tensions, and distractions involved in running a normal household and family thus enable women to forego the Shmona Esrei. The upshot of this, however, is that unmarried women and other women, if they are living peaceful and unharried lives, are obligated in Shmona Esrei at least twice daily, Shacharit and Mincha. Rav Henkin, again, just like I said about the Maharam, I think it's a beautiful redemption and a tragedy. That on the one hand, he released the women from this guilt of, if they're not davening, this feeling that they're doing something really bad. On the other hand, he kind of let them go. And what do we have left? Like when I read that Rav Henkin, I say, okay, so I don't have to daven because I'm so distracted by my kids, but then how do I connect to Hashem? So growing up in Israel, a lot of people talked about how changing diapers and cleaning the house, that's our connection with Hashem. And there are people that's totally fine for, and I have no criticism on them at all. It doesn't do it for me. And I feel like I spent a lot of time and effort building my own relationship with this. And one of the things that I feel for me is very important is that I haven't given up davening. And on the one hand, I don't always have such great kavanah. And many times my friends ask me, you daven twice a day, but do you really mean it? And I say, nope. And then they say, so why do you do it? And I say, because if I don't, then I won't even have that. And I daven twice a day, hoping that every once in a while I'll really mean it. But often I don't. And I feel like one of the big challenges today is to really kind of grasp both those pieces. To say, yes, the Maharam told us that kavanah is not what it was, and it's really hard. And even when it was what it was, we saw the Morim had a hard time. So kind of being accepting of ourselves, being in this place that we don't have such great kavanah. On the other hand, to still strive to reach kavanah and to not give up. And I feel like it's really hard to grasp both sides, but I feel like it's really important. I want to share, Rabbi Goldman's mentioned my book, and I want to just share why my book came out and what it's about. So a couple of years ago, a bunch of years ago, I taught a class about Yom Kippur, and in my class was a woman who started crying as I was speaking. And I said, oh, what's wrong? And she said, everybody just keeps talking about Yom Kippur and the fast and Neila and all the things that happen in shul. And she had gestational diabetes. She wasn't going to be fasting, and she wasn't going to be at shul. And she said, where am I with all of this? You know, what do I do with that? And it really touched me, what she said. And then a couple years later, I was sitting in bed, drinking shiurim and davening, and with a baby in my arms, and in a very similar situation. And between davening and lying in bed davening, I was trying to learn a little bit. And I felt that all the pieces I learned were all relating to a Yom Kippur that I wasn't experiencing. So I read Hasidim and I read whatever, and everything I read, it was all very beautiful, but it all made me cringe a little bit and say, oh no, but I'm not there, right? Neila and Tefilah b'tzibur and fasting, all those things that are intrinsic parts of Yom Kippur were not relevant for me that year. And I decided I must write a book for people who are in that situation, who can read a book without cringing every second. I actually started kind of planning this book a few years ago, but then last year during Corona, I felt like it was even more necessary. So I decided to write it up, and I had it edited, and I didn't know where I was going to put it out. And then I called, there's a publication here called the Brishir, and they put out a lot of books that were kind of, I felt like it was like the right, tzibur, that it was going to be, the people who would read my book. And I called them up very late. It must have been August. It was like Tammuz or Av. It was very, very close to Yom Kippur. And I called them and I said, listen, I wrote a book about Yom Kippur. Would you like to publish my book? So they said, talk to us next year. This year is not relevant. So a little bit of assertivity came up, and I said, you know what? I'm putting out my book, whether you like it or not. Do you want to be a part of it or not? So they said, okay, we'll read it. They read the manuscript, and Baruch Hashem, they loved it, and they put it out. But I feel like it doesn't really matter whether I put out the book or not. But it does matter that I got so many responses of people that either said, the idea of your book touched me, or they said, I can't read your book because I don't have time, because I have little kids. And every person who says that to me, I said, this book is for you. It's very short pieces. It's very, I'm going to say light, but it's light but not light. But like, it's really built for people who are in between diapers and wiping fishies and, making whatever for their kid and what young people. And for me, that was a very meaningful piece. And I feel like the most meaningful experience I had in response to my book was someone called me up and she said, my mother-in-law has diabetes, she can't fast, and she didn't read your book, but she read the article that was written up about your book, and the article was so inspiring to her that it helped her through Yom Kippur. And I said, oh my goodness, even not reading the book, it was so inspiring. That's like the greatest success you can have, right? It doesn't sell books, but it was very meaningful for me. And I feel like a lot of my life is kind of bridging the gap between a life of living in the Beit Midrash, which I kind of do. Baruch Hashem, I've had the privilege of, studying for quite a few years in Beit Midrash. But I really deal a lot with the women who are not there. And I'm also, most of my life is not there. Like, even if I spend some hours in the Beit Midrash, most of my life is, cooking, cleaning, and not changing diapers anymore, but wiping dirty tissues and cleaning dirty accidents. And I love my life, but it's sometimes hard to bridge that gap. And but I think it's a very important gap to bridge. I think I'll return to you, Rabbi Goldman. I'll let you have a turn.
It's fine with me. You could keep going.
I'll go to the end, but you can take a turn.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I want to talk a little bit about the issue of being a parent from a slightly different perspective, actually start out a little bit from the perspective of the child. I'll tell you one of my favorite stories. One of my favorite stories about young kids and faith. It's in an elementary school art class. Little kids are all at their desks drawing. And the teacher comes over to one young child and says to her, "What are you drawing? What is that?" And she said, "It's a picture of God." And the teacher says, "Well, nobody really knows what God looks like." And the child says, "They will soon." Or another one is when one of my own children, I remember when my wife's grandmother passed away, and we were cleaning out the apartment and going through her things. And one of my children, who was very young at the time, said that when they called her Oma, that when Oma comes back, for Tchiat HaMeitim, isn't she going to want all of her stuff back again? Compare those stories with some of the things that you hear about adolescents. We just heard Rachel speak about her own struggle with Tefilah when she was younger, through the 9th grade. And I, as a high school educator, come across this sort of all of the time. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. This is excerpts from one student who I asked to keep a Tefilah diary. She said, "I was really awake for davening today. I guess that means this is off to a good start. It's also Rosh Chodesh, which is awesome because I love Hallel. I think I really connect to Hashem more during Hallel. There's just something really special about it. Maybe it's because we don't say it very often. I don't know. Day 2. I didn't daven today. I really wasn't feeling it. Davening made me so happy yesterday, but then today was the complete opposite. I refuse to daven if I know I'm not going to have the proper kavanah. I want to daven, but I don't want to fake the connection. That defeats the whole purpose. Day 3. I was so tired today. I was practically falling asleep in my seat. That's what happens most days. I can't daven when I'm tired, so I don't try. These ambivalent feelings about davening come from a student like many, many other students who are not kids who are, one has to be worried about them in the long term religiously. They're not off the derech, as it were, or at risk. They're just kids who are struggling with davening. And so my question is, what happened to those wonderful, idealistic, believing, faithful, non-cynical young children? What happened between the time that they were so enthralled and could see God and could scream their lungs out about Mashiach and then become adolescents? So I'd like to suggest that we need to think about this collectively more developmentally. That is to say, that if we know that there's such a thing as social development in young children, or there's such a thing as cognitive development, where we know that we can't give young elementary school students higher level math because their brains aren't developed enough to be able to handle it, the abstractions. So we know that there are stages that they go through in terms of cognitive development. We know that's true of moral development and social emotional development. So maybe there's something also, or I know now that there's something called religious development as well that goes hand in hand with those other capacities. So, for example, there is one researcher that I know of in Israel, actually, who did some studies about cognitive development in Tefilah, and to see what kinds of stages kids go through in their relationship to Tefilah. So she discovered that in kindergarten, for example, a young child believes that if you don't cover your eyes during Shema, then your prayers won't be heard. You thus begin to get a feel that prayer for younger children, in some ways, Tefilah, Sidur, is much more concrete. Similarly, students in the first and second grade said, boys, that if you don't wear a kippah and tzitzit, then your prayers won't be heard. It's only if you wear them that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will hear you. And then children in the fourth grade came to understand that Hashem doesn't act arbitrarily, but rather according to certain rules. And therefore, to pray with kavanah means to pray really, really hard. And then only then will your prayers be answered. And obviously, the older a child gets, the efficacy of prayer is seen in a more complex constellation of factors, which are increasingly hard to align. If you take this issue of the efficacy of prayer, does prayer really work? Then think about what happens when, as a child gets older, that if they are growing intellectually, cognitively, and they are growing socially and emotionally, then it makes sense that when they become adolescents, they're going to take these capacities in the same way that they apply them to math and to school and to the world around them. They're going to apply it to Tefilah as well. And that's why this researcher found that kids, as they got closer to adolescence, just thought that it didn't make sense anymore. And the truth is that they're right to some extent, because if you daven and you ask really, really hard and your tefillah doesn't come true, then you know that there's something wrong with the system. It doesn't make sense. And this drop, this dip in commitment to tefillah is something that's been replicated in other studies, non-Jewish ones as well, that finds that when kids reach those early teen years, the belief in the efficacy of prayer goes down. This researcher, Rena Rosenberg was her name, discovered that that when that happened, when that sort of crisis occurs, then kids walk away from davening. Because it's meaningless, it feels hypocritical, and there's nothing more serious for an adolescent than hypocrisy. However, and she did the study in Mamlachti schools and Mamlachti Dati schools, and a little, I believe, as well in Yeshiva Tichonit. But what she discovered is that while the public school kids who had been praying walked away from it, the Mamlachti Dati kids, while some did walk away, others stuck with it. And what was it that kept them in? Because otherwise, as I said, it makes much more sense to walk away. I remember one father said to me that it makes so much sense to think about this drop in Tefilah, because he said, because of their development at this stage, he said, my son stopped davening right around the same time he stopped listening to me. And it's the same thing. You talk to principals of ninth grade students, and you often get calls from parents saying, when my child was younger, they loved to daven, they loved to be a chazan, they loved to go to shul, loved to be a chazanit. But now they don't really like to daven. What did you do to my child? And it's not so much, obviously, what one does to their child as much as in the normal course of development, what happens. Anyway, Rosenberg discovered that the kids who stuck with Tefilah stuck with it because they shifted their focus in Tefilah. That is to say, they began to think of Tefilah in terms of what impact it had on them as people. They started to internalize what the messages of Tefilah were, or what the experience of Tefilah was. It was as much about themselves as it was about a connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what that should mean for us as parents and educators is that there's, stuff going on inside. That there is much to kids' internal lives that is going on in the process of Tefilah. Young kids who don't understand God the way that we might, young kids who don't understand the word kavanah necessarily in the same way that an adult would, and older kids who, while turning it inward, are wrestling for meaning and to make meaning. And all of that, what I think means is that we make a horrible mistake by judging davening or talking to kids about davening only about the externals. As a matter of fact, it's precisely because this is such an internal process, it's hard for anybody on the outside to really know what's going on the inside. And so instead, at least in terms of education, what's frequently done is judging kids on the basis of their external behaviors, whether they're shuckling enough, whether they're holding the siddur the right way, whether they're saying things out loud. And that seems to me to be totally missing the boat. Instead, we need to be focusing on their internal lives, and how much do we really do that? By the same token, there is another school of thought that says that Tefilah and religiosity, spirituality, is not so much related to the cognitive process as much as it is related to the emotional one. And these researchers, non-Jewish researchers, but spirituality has gotten a tremendous amount of attention in the last 20 years. But these researchers have discovered or feel that man is innately spiritual, that there is something within us that we're born with, that makes us look for the transcendent. We might call it Tzelem Elokim. But Yehuda Halevi said that prayer is to the soul what food is to the body. This isn't something that we think about cognitively. It's something that we know emotionally, something that we desperately need. I remember once being at a Shabbaton and a girl came to me to say that she had been struggling with Tefilah. She asked all of her teachers, and nobody could come up with an answer. And she said to me, "Why should I pray?" It was sort of like, in 2 words or less, tell me, why should I pray? And I don't know where it came from, but I told her I pray because I cannot not pray. And for her, this was like the biggest revelation in the world. It speaks to what Rav Kook talks about when he says that the soul is always praying. Kids, young children have a natural curiosity about nature and life and death and God. And young children, we know, are able to see things and perceive things with a clarity for transcendence that many adults lack. The reason, says this research, why we grow up and we seem to have kids who feel like they're missing adults, who feel like they're missing them, it's because they're out of touch with that capacity for transcendence. And the reason is because when they were younger children and they talked about it with adults, adults did not respond in kind. They quickly said, when asked questions, bigger questions about God or life and death or where things come from, go ask your teacher, or I don't know, or things like that. And kids quickly realize what questions are important, what questions adults care about, and what they don't. And the reason that many adults don't answer those questions is not just because they don't know the answers, but because they're uncomfortable with the language of spirituality and emotion, because we're not really raised, unfortunately, to talk about it much. And so for within our community, to be sure, we often divert the attention, the questions to halacha. We see Tefilah as a halachic endeavor, which it surely is. But when we talk to kids about it, and even when we talk to adults about it, we talk about the things that you may and may not do, the things you must and must not say, as opposed to talking about the spirituality and emotion that is inherent in Tefilah and is inherent in any relationship when we talk about wanting them to have a relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So here again, it's about talking to kids or educating kids or parenting kids with a sensitivity toward their internal lives, toward their emotional lives. And like, as I described in the cognitive sense, that there are things going on inside, so too there should be things going on inside, or have to be. That's the piece we need to connect to. Rav Soloveitchik says that that piece is so important that it may in fact be the key factor in whether we fulfill the mitzvah or not. But again, we get kids to recite the words, but we never ask them what the words mean to them. And we make sure that they're pronouncing the words correctly, but without asking them what their hearts are saying. We tell them that they have a chiyuv, an obligation to daven, but we seldom talk to them about their relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's ironic because we know that adolescence is a period of, adolescence in particular, we know that children are spiritual, but we know that adolescence is the time of life where there's a craving for spirituality and meaning and transcendence in kids' lives. We know this from all kinds of studies that have been done, including relating to heritability, like genetic predispositions to davening, that kids, as they want to grow in terms of meaning as well, and spirituality, religiosity, a relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, are all a part of that search. And I think we rob them of their an easier transition to adulthood if we don't address that. Recognizing as well that the truth is that davening is incredibly difficult for all of us, as you heard Rachel describe. both individually and in terms of the roles that we play in life. And I would like to suggest that davening is especially difficult these days for young people because of technology. I hate sort of bringing up technology. It's like the whipping boy for everything when we talk about young people and adults today. But the truth is that when it comes to Tefilah and wanting to have a sense of stillness and sort of inner directed life, technology is all about the opposite of that. So I think we need to think differently about davening, not as something that we tell kids to do, but something that we teach them how to do, or to help take their natural inclinations towards spirituality and show them how to express it through Tefilah. So I'll give you, that's sort of the theory, and in the practice, I'll give you a sense of how I see this playing out in parenting and in educating as well. I guess the first thing that I would ask is, what's your personal relationship to Tefilah? How do you feel about going to shul? How do you feel about davening? That's critical, obviously, because attitudes are taught, not caught. Attitudes are caught, not taught. As I tell teachers all the time, you can't hope to impact students if you're not working on yourself at the same time. And I think that's true of parents as well. And it's especially, concerning in our community. I keep going back to a survey that was done of the modern Orthodox community here in America a few years ago, in which was discovered that, according to the survey, whether it's totally accurate or not, but 84% of men go to shul every Shabbos and 52% of women go to shul every Shabbos. But only 42% of both of those groups find Tefilah meaningful. If that's the case, how could it be meaningful for their children? And the same is true that in a related vein about modeling, that I know it sounds a little trite that parents need to be role models, but it's just true. It's the difficult truth sometimes. Difficult because it often means that we have to sacrifice for our kids when it comes to, we do it in so many other areas in our lives. We should be doing it in Tefilah as well. Is one prepared to sacrifice to change your habits about shul going, or about davening, or about the way that you daven, the way that your kids see you daven? When you go to shul, do you take a book with you to read? Does your child see that? Do you take the time to daven a longer Shemona Esrei sometime, or to actually try to do benching with kavanah? And even if you're not into it at the moment, how important it is to do it for one's children. And it's especially tricky because, as I always say, that we got to the point where we did in our religious lives through whatever struggles and journey that we took, so that I could miss davening one day and it wouldn't really make a difference in my religious development. I'm just taking a break, and I know I'm going to go back. But when my child sees that I'm not going to davening, what lessons do they take? In addition, therefore, I would tell you to become a seeker, to let your child know that you are working on your own Tefilah. Go to a different minyan once in a while, or if your child is a singer, go to a Carlbach minyan together, even if you hate it, or if he or she hates singing, find a minyan that davens more deliberately, or go to a Hashkama minyan, or a different shul, do benching differently. When you're on a family vacation, daven together, or do Kabbalat Shabbat together, sing Ashrei together. Do whatever you can to show that davening matters to you. And then I would say that one needs to talk to one's child about davening. We talk about everything else with them, about sports and business and other people, how much do we talk to kids about our own relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And by that I mean sort of sharing one's own inner life. I love this line in Ashrei because it reminds me of that vacation we went on together, or I'm having trouble with X, or we have been having with X, or somebody's not well, I'm going to insert it into my Shemona Esrei today. To teach them, therefore, in addition, how to connect to the words, what meaning you personally attach to some of those words, because otherwise, to them, they will sort of just be words. And as I've said, think more developmentally about our kids. Young kids under the age of 6, where there's no obligation for chinuch. They need the excitement and the enthusiasm that comes with davening. And then as they grow older, it's not so much about how to daven, but about why, the sense of awe and wonder, the gratitude that we have to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu, singing, celebrating. Shul going should be something special. They need to know that tefillot are answered, or at least listened to, and they need it simple, straight, and true. As kids get older, and ages sort of 6 to 9, they move along that continuum of talking to God, and one should get in the habit of speaking from the heart and having a relationship. And then as they get sort of age 10 and above, to start pushing toward normalization, but always to keep in mind that quality beats quantity anytime. And developmentally, that also means that if ADHD kids need space, and each child is different, and there's sort of like an individualized spirituality about each one of our children, just as they are individuals in so many other ways. And time is running out, but occasionally I would say acknowledge that sometimes tefillah isn't always easy. Our kids need to know that sometimes we do things because it's a mitzvah, because we're submitting to the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we do it even though we may struggle with it at times. But that's okay. I think in this day and age especially, we need to emphasize sort of grit and perseverance and tenacity with our kids around the subject of mitzvot. That said, I have some other things, but time is running out, and so I would simply say that the more we can speak to our kids' hearts, the more that we can try to tap into their internal lives, the more likely it will be that they will attach themselves to these mitzvot and find meaning in them. I think it was the Kotzker who says, that these words should be on your heart. And he said they are on your heart because there will come a time when your heart will open and they will drop in, but they need to be on your heart all the time. And we can only do the best that we can do. There are no guarantees. As my mother, Zichrona Livracha, used to say, you can do everything that you possibly can till they're teenagers, and after that, all you could do is daven. With that, I'm going to turn back to my partner here, Rachel, who had a couple of other things that she wanted to add.
First of all, that was so beautiful, Rabbi Goldman, and I'm really inspired. I wanted to add a couple words that I think are very much on the same grain as what Rabbi Goldman is saying. An idea that I heard once from my brother-in-law, who was supposed to join us, but I see he didn't make it, but I like to quote him. He talks about how sometimes you just send regards to Hashem, and sometimes you have a whole conversation with Hashem, and he calls it Dash LaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I feel like this is so true, how sometimes we have this whole long conversation, but just like with a friend, how if you've had like long conversations, there's friends that like you haven't seen for years, but like when you see them, it's a real conversation. But if you really don't keep in touch with them at all, it's very hard for that conversation to be real. So every once in a while, you kind of say hi, happy birthday, or whatever. So my brother-in-law likes to say that that's what davening is like sometimes. And again, I think, like Rabbi Goldman said, it's a struggle to remember that we're striving for more, but to be real and to see that it's sometimes less, but to remember that kind of little piece, those little davenings that aren't the real thing, they're not what we're really dreaming of, but they're keeping us going, are a big part of davening. I also just want to say that in the source sheet that I brought, there's another piece that I didn't read. I'm not going to read, but it is a piece for my book that is kind of saying what we just said, and you're welcome to download and take a look. And it's in there. And I think we're going to open to questions. Is that right? Should we open to questions? Do we have questions in our chat room?
Not yet. But if anybody does have questions, we would love to entertain them. I would I would simply add that not hawking my own wares, but I also wrote a commentary on the Siddur that became, Baruch Hashem, very popular. And I think, I can't speak to Rachel's book because I honestly didn't read it yet. But and unfortunately for some of you, it's in Hebrew. So hopefully maybe she'll translate it or get it translated. B'karov. But I would simply say, I just think people are, in both cases, people are looking for meaning. People just, in our generation, I think it's especially true of kids, but I think it's true of adults too. Everybody's just looking for meaning and to be touched. And that's what we need to do more of, both for us as adults and then in turn for our kids. And for each of us, it'll be different. Different things speak to us. This took me a long time to learn. Took me a long time to learn that one man's meat is another man's poison. Spirituality manifests itself in different ways. So I'm just gonna sorry. So one question is, I think, am I seeing correctly? I'm having a bit of a hard time negotiating this. My apologies. Would you handle these kinds of questions in a group setting or individual only when it comes to high school students, specifically girls? So my answer is both, just differently. I think that it's very important to talk to kids in a group about these issues, but it would be more valuable to have kids talking out loud with one another about their own struggles and about the way that they overcome them. You'd be amazed at how articulate and sensitive they can be and how supportive they can be with one another in this area. But if you're talking from the perspective of then individual kids, so clearly everybody deserves a voice and to be listened to as well. And I think those conversations are always important to have, whether it's about anything related to one's attachment to Torah mitzvah. Rachel, there's a question or a statement here. I don't know if it was part of the previous one, that many girls feel that they don't have an obligation, especially when they see mixed messages among the teacher role models. Yeah,
I want to say something about that. first of all, it's true that there are mixed messages, and even as you saw in the sources, it's not 100% clear across the board that women are obligated to daven. I I'll tell you what I think, but there are other people who can say other things. I feel like the message to a woman who's not married is that I think, according to most opinions, a woman who doesn't have the burden of child rearing and a home should be davening, according to many opinions, not all. But beyond that, I think davening is a privilege, and like I said, what can I do about the role models? All I can say is, teachers, please daven, and talk about it, and we all should be davening. But I think that the loss of not davening is such a great loss, and I would urge girls to try. Now, I didn't teach high school as much as Ray Goldman's did. I've only taught high school for a few years. I felt like many of the high school girls I spoke to weren't interested. They weren't there yet. But I still think, even though they weren't there yet, even if I say something now that maybe in 20 years they'll look back and say, "Oh, Mrs. Weinstein said whatever it is," and maybe you never know how things touch people. But that's what I would say. That I feel like it's something that whether or not every single opinion says that you're obligated, it's something that it's a tragedy not to daven. That's how I see it.
Rachel, there's another question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, how do I feel comfortable with talking to Hashem with my own words rather than using the davening if I don't have time? So I want to say I relate to that halachically, and then on two levels. So first of all, halachically, as you saw, the Magen Avraham really seems to be saying that that's a valid halachic option, so that exists. Personally, I think that it's a good idea to learn the minimal text davening, and there is such a thing. And this year I had a lot of conversations. One of the rabbis I spoke to said you can daven in 8 minutes. So obviously davening in 8 minutes is not going to have a lot of kavana, but I would say it's better than not davening. And I'd like to encourage students of all ages, I mostly teach adults, to do both, say the text and add their own prayers. And when you learn the Shmoneh Esrei, so each piece in the Shmoneh Esrei can be related to a different part of our lives. For example, when you want to daven for the sick, you say it in Rafa'enu. When you want to daven for your sustenance, physical sustenance, you can say it in Birkat HaShanim. And I feel like that's really the ideal, to use both the text and your own words. And yes, I feel like sometimes we feel more connected to our own words if we don't really understand the words of the text. But I feel like if sometimes we read the words of the text and listen to what we're saying, the words are so beautiful. You need to understand Hebrew for that, but I like the combination. I don't know if that really answered your question.
Okay. I think we're just about at an end. I want to thank, first of all, Rachel for her collaboration. We didn't know one another before, but it's been a real pleasure, and I hope we can continue to collaborate. And I want to thank all of you who joined today. This is such an important topic. These are things, unfortunately, again, that we don't talk about a lot. Women who find themselves in situations for the first time, and the sudden break from their past can be very difficult and traumatic. And there isn't always, nobody really talks about it so much. And similarly, we don't often talk about our kids and their spiritual lives, their inner lives. And we talk about parenting sometimes, but we don't always talk about parenting religiously. And I think especially in this day and age, we need to do so with intentionality in a way that we didn't. In any event, we thank you. I speak on behalf of Rachel. We thank you both. We thank you all, I'm sorry, for joining. And we thank Nishmat for putting together this amazing program. Zehu. Kol tov to everybody.